In the forgotten valleys of Eastern Europe, where dense forests shroud old ruins in mist, lies a chilling tale that has endured for centuries. Whispers tell of a vampire village, a place where superstition and fear once dictated daily life, and where folklore and fact still blur into one unsettling legend. Travelers speak of a remote settlement in the Carpathian region, an isolated community tucked deep within the mountains. It was said that when night fell, its streets emptied and doors were barred tight. Few dared to enter, and those who did rarely stayed beyond sundown. What makes this legend unique is not just the fear of the unknown, but the unsettling evidence that lingers beneath the soil. Archaeologists and historians alike have uncovered disturbing remains, bones scarred by fire, skeletons buried in unusual positions, and graves treated with rituals meant to restrain the dead. Some graves contained corpses staked through the chest, others with stones forced into their mouths, and a few buried face down, measures taken by desperate villagers who feared the return of those they once called family. But were these truly vampires, or simply victims of disease, violence, and fear? The answer lies in the chilling mix of folklore and medieval life, where science was limited and the supernatural filled every gap in understanding. Before we uncover the secrets of this eerie village, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Lodge for more unsettling journeys into the mysteries of history. Your support helps us continue bringing these forgotten tales to life. To understand the origins of this village's dark reputation, we must step back into the medieval era. In those times, death was a constant companion. Plagues, famine, and sudden illness ravaged communities, often leaving people desperate for explanations. In such uncertainty, the line between natural misfortune and supernatural forces blurred. A lingering sickness, a child's sudden death, or an unexplainable wasting illness was often blamed not on medicine, but on the undead. Historical records show that fear of revenants, restless corpses, spread widely across Europe between the 12th and 18th centuries. Priests, physicians, and even kings wrote about these supposed night-stalking beings, giving their existence credibility in the eyes of villagers. The so-called vampire village may have been just one of many places where these beliefs took root, but it gained notoriety because its burial practices left behind undeniable traces. Unlike legends written in books, this was a community where superstition was etched into the very soil. Archaeological studies reveal that villagers performed drastic rites to prevent the dead from rising. Staking the heart was not always enough. Some bodies were weighted with heavy stones, others decapitated, and some burned to ashes. Such practices were not random. They followed patterns seen in other vampire burials across Europe, from Poland to Bulgaria, where communities shared the same desperate rituals. The villagers truly believed they were defending themselves from an enemy that struck not in life, but after death. But why here? Why did this particular village become infamous above all others? Was it because of repeated outbreaks of plague? Or perhaps because of individuals who, in death, fit the terrifying descriptions of revenants, bloated corpses, reddish skin, and lips stained with blood from decomposing fluids? As the evidence mounts, we see a community ruled by fear, where each grave tells a story. Yet this is only the beginning. The true terror of the vampire village lies not just in how its people treated their dead, but in why they believed the dead were hunting them. When modern researchers unearthed the old cemetery of the vampire village, they were struck by the peculiar nature of the graves. These were not ordinary burials. Instead, the ground revealed a battlefield between the living and the dead. Some skeletons had iron spikes driven through their ribs or sternum. In medieval belief, this pinned the corpse to the earth, preventing it from leaving the grave at night. The villagers weren't burying their loved ones, they were imprisoning them. Other remains told even darker stories. Skulls were found separated from their bodies, often placed between the legs or beside the chest. Decapitation, it seems, was a common safeguard. Without a head, the dead could not rise. Still more bodies bore signs of fire. Charred bones suggested that villagers set corpses ablaze to reduce them to ash, ensuring no spirit or revenant could take shape again. To these people, burning was the final, desperate act of protection. What's remarkable is that these practices match accounts found in historical texts. Chroniclers from across Eastern Europe describe the same methods: staking, decapitation, and burning. It was not an isolated superstition, but part of a wider network of medieval fears. One particularly chilling discovery was the placement of stones inside the mouths of certain corpses. This was no accident. Medieval villagers feared that the dead might chew through burial shrouds or even rise to feed on the living. Stones silenced the corpse forever. Imagine the terror that must have gripped this community. Every strange sound at night, every unexplained illness, every sudden death might have been blamed on a neighbor who had recently passed. Trust could erode quickly, turning grief into suspicion. In fact, written accounts from the 14th century describe entire families exhuming relatives only days after burial, convinced that they had returned from the grave to spread disease or misfortune. Fear made the villagers act swiftly and brutally. The vampire village, however, stands apart because so many graves show evidence of these practices concentrated in one place. It was not an occasional ritual. It was a pattern that lasted for generations. Archaeologists studying the soil layers discovered that the graves span multiple centuries. The same techniques were used over and over again, suggesting that the fear of vampires persisted here far longer than in most communities. Was the village cursed by repeated plagues? Or were there individuals whose deaths appeared so unnatural that the community felt compelled to respond? Historians can only speculate, but the graves themselves reveal how deeply superstition shaped their world. Interestingly, not all burials showed these violent rituals. Many graves were ordinary, respectful, and traditional. This contrast suggests that only certain individuals were singled out, those deemed suspicious in life or terrifying in death. Perhaps these were outsiders, strangers who settled in the village. Or maybe they were locals who died suddenly without confession or last rites. In the medieval mind, both were vulnerable to becoming revenants. As we sift through this evidence, a chilling picture emerges. A community living in constant fear, turning against its own dead and waging a silent war against an enemy that may never have existed. And yet, the terror that guided their hands left permanent scars on the earth. To truly understand the vampire village, we need to step inside the minds of the medieval people who lived there. What we now call superstition was, for them, a survival tool, a way to explain the unexplainable and guard against unseen dangers. The roots of vampire lore stretch deep into European folklore. Long before the word vampire became known, stories of revenants, restless corpses that returned from the grave, haunted villages across the continent. These revenants were not elegant aristocrats in cloaks, but terrifying figures. Chronicles describe them as bloated, discolored, and foul-smelling, often leaking fluids that stained their lips. To villagers, this was undeniable proof that the dead were feeding on the living. Modern science explains these appearances as natural stages of decomposition. As gases build inside the body, the skin stretches and discolors. Fluids may leak from the mouth, giving the illusion of blood. But to medieval eyes, this was evidence of something monstrous. Such fears were often triggered by epidemics. When plague or tuberculosis spread silently through a village, the living struggled to explain why entire households fell ill. It was easy to blame a corpse for draining the life of its kin from beyond the grave. This belief gave rise to gruesome rituals. Families sometimes reopened graves, searching for corpses that looked too alive. If they found one, they would mutilate the body, staking, decapitating, or burning it to stop the supposed curse. The vampire village was no exception. Archaeological evidence suggests that multiple outbreaks of disease struck the community. With each wave, villagers repeated the same desperate acts, reinforcing the legend of their cursed dead. One haunting record from the 15th century describes how villagers in Eastern Europe exhumed a woman's corpse after several neighbors died suddenly. They believed she had returned to claim their lives. When her grave was opened, her body appeared swollen and fresh. Terrified, they cut out her heart and burned it. It is easy to dismiss these acts as ignorance, but they reveal a culture doing its best to confront the unknown. Without medicine or science, superstition became a framework for protection, a way to make sense of tragedy. Over time, these beliefs spread and evolved. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea of the vampire had reached Western Europe, where it fascinated scholars, priests, and even governments. Reports of vampire attacks filled newspapers, fueling both fear and fascination. But while other places eventually abandoned such beliefs, the vampire village seemed to cling to them longer than most. For centuries, its people performed rituals against revenants, leaving behind a unique archaeological footprint. Why did fear linger here so strongly? Was the village struck harder by disease than others? Or did its isolation keep superstition alive when neighboring communities moved on? The truth may never be fully known. What we do know is that this village became a symbol of Europe's darkest fears, a reminder that for medieval people, the dead were not gone. They were a constant, looming presence, capable of returning in terrifying ways. And so, the line between folklore and reality blurred. The vampire village was not just a place of stories. It was a place where belief shaped every burial, every ritual, and every shadow that fell across its graveyard. Every village has its legends, and the vampire village was no different. Here, tales of restless spirits were passed down through generations, reinforced by each strange death, each shadowy event that could not be explained. Local lore speaks of a noble family that once ruled over the village centuries ago. They were said to have lived in a fortified manor overlooking the settlement, their wealth and power commanding both fear and respect. When famine struck or disease spread, suspicion often fell upon this family. In the minds of peasants, those who thrived during hardship were viewed with mistrust. Some whispered that their prosperity came not from trade or land, but from drinking the vitality of others. One chilling tale tells of a lord whose body was buried in the church crypt. Yet within days, villagers claimed to hear footsteps. Why did fear lie hoeing inside the chapel at night? Livestock were found drained of blood, and so, terrified, the people opened his tomb. Inside, the corpse was said to be bloated and ruddy, its lips dark as if freshly fed. The villagers panicked, removing the body, staking it, and finally burning it in the fields outside the village. The story endured, marking the family forever in rumor. Such legends were not unique. Across Europe, nobles were often accused of dark practices, partly because they lived apart from common villagers, and partly because their power made them easy targets for suspicion. The vampire village may have drawn much of its fear from these rumors, blending genuine burials with layers of folklore, until the line between fact and myth disappeared. Every unusual death became further evidence of vampirism. The village's location added to the mystery. Hidden deep in the Carpathian foothills, it was cut off from bustling trade routes and larger towns. Isolated communities often clung longer to superstition, their beliefs unchallenged by outside knowledge. Historical records show that neighboring settlements gradually abandoned vampire rituals by the 16th century, yet the people here seemed to hold on much longer. Their cemeteries revealed practices spanning hundreds of years, an unbroken chain of fear. Legends also tied the village to the crusading knights who once passed through the region. Soldiers returning from distant wars brought back strange stories of demons, curses, and blood-drinking spirits. Such tales may have been woven into local beliefs, giving them an exotic edge. Imagine the power of such rumors in a time when oral tradition was the only record. A tale told by a knight returning from the Holy Land could echo for generations, reshaping the way villagers saw death itself. And yet, behind the folklore, the evidence in the graves remains real. Whatever fueled the stories, family scandals, crusader legends, or unexplained plagues, the villagers acted upon their fears with chilling precision. Their rituals were not random acts of hysteria, but deliberate, repeated, and consistent. This suggests an organized belief system, one that endured through centuries, giving the vampire village its lasting notoriety. But what ultimately became of this settlement? Why did it vanish into history, leaving behind only bones, ruins, and stories of the undead? The answer lies in its mysterious decline, a disappearance that remains unsolved to this day. By the early 1500s, the vampire village began to fade from the records of history. Once a living community, its houses, farms, and chapel slowly fell silent, leaving only fragments for us to piece together today. Some historians suggest the village was abandoned for practical reasons. As sheep farming and the wool trade became profitable, landowners cleared peasants from the countryside, forcing communities like this one to vanish. Others believe disease played a role. Outbreaks of plague swept across Europe, and an isolated settlement might not have survived repeated epidemics. To the villagers, these tragedies could only strengthen their fear that revenants were at work. What is certain is that when the village finally disappeared, its cemetery remained, carrying the unmistakable marks of its people's fear. Bones, scorched and scarred, silently testified to rituals meant to keep the dead at rest. For centuries, the vampire village was forgotten, its ruins swallowed by earth and forest. But when archaeologists uncovered its graves, they reignited the mystery, sparking debates among scholars and fueling legends among storytellers. Modern science tells us the rituals were born of misunderstanding. Decomposition, disease, and poor medical knowledge created the illusion of vampirism. What villagers mistook for blood on the lips was decay. What they thought was a corpse moving was only the shifting of gases. And yet, this scientific explanation does not erase the power of their fear. The rituals were real. The stakes, stones, and burned remains all point to a community so consumed by dread that it waged war against its own dead for generations. In this way, the vampire village offers us more than just a tale of superstition. It reveals how humans respond to fear, how communities build stories to explain tragedy, and how those stories leave lasting marks on history. Even now, when we look at those graves, it is impossible not to feel the echo of that terror. Imagine the villagers gathered in the dark, torches in hand, dragging a coffin from the earth. Every strike of the spade was an act of desperation. Every spark of fire, a plea for safety. Perhaps that is why the legend endures. It is not only about vampires, it is about survival, belief, and the fragile line between life and death. In a world where answers were scarce and shadows seemed alive. Today, visitors to the region sometimes search for the ruins of the village. The stones of old houses still linger, half hidden by grass and trees. To stand there is to stand among centuries of fear, where silence carries stories the earth has not forgotten. So, was the vampire village truly cursed? Or was it merely a reflection of the fears that haunted medieval life? That is a question you must answer for yourself. The graves speak, but they do not tell the whole story. If you've enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, don't forget to subscribe to the Silent Lodge. Here, we bring the past to life, its shadows, its secrets, and its most unsettling tales. The vampire village may be gone, but its legend endures, reminding us that even in death, fear can leave its mark upon the living. Until next time, thank you for joining us in the lodge.